Hello there. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first program of the Redmond Historical Society Virtual Saturday Speaker Series in 2021. I'm Lorelei Bennett. I am the Executive Vice President, following Marty Rockenbeck's footsteps. And with me today are several people, but I would like to introduce you to Holly Turner, who will be our moderator for today's program. Holly, take it away.
Thank you, Lorelei, and good morning, everyone. I'll be monitoring responses today during our program, and we'll have a short time for questions following each section of our presentation today. To submit a question or comment, just go to the bottom of your Zoom window and use the chat or the Q&A feature. Look for the speech bubble icons or the three dots indicating more options. You can use the chat feature to send a message to all attendees or to just panelists. Just choose your preferred recipients using the drop-down menu in the chat window. However, you can also use the Q&A feature. I'll be looking at that as well. This feature includes an option to send us a question or comment anonymously if you would prefer. Just make sure you've checked the box marked send anonymously when making a submission. So to go ahead and test out those features, we'd love to hear a little bit about some of your experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, since we'll be talking a little bit about pandemics today. So have you received the vaccine? If so, where? And what was that experience like? Now, no rush to get those answers in. We'll touch on those responses after the first section of our presentation in a little bit. But first, I would like to introduce our president, John Ofterbro, for a few words about the Society.
Hey, everybody. You know, if you were coming into our Saturday speaker series 2 years ago, this is what you would have experienced. The same weather we're having today. So after a week, Tom was able to do his program, and that was fine. But here we are by the magic of Zoom. And well, good news. After almost 3 years, we are finally back in the old Redmond schoolhouse. We got it painted, we got the floor fixed, new heaters, lights, windows are fixed, larger space, and thanks to Redmond Parks and the City of Redmond and the Lake Washington School District, we have our new home. It won't be ready for months, but we're looking forward to it. And before we move on, I have a couple of distinguished service awards to tell you about. We've had two of our longtime board members retire as of the first of the year, and the first award is for Indira Krishnaswamy, with gratitude for outstanding and devoted work since 2015 in accounting, finance, and fundraising. And to Margie Rockenbach, right there next to me. Oh, that way. Margie, with gratitude for outstanding and devoted work since 2017 in communications, publicity, and leadership, and developing excellent in Saturday Speaker Series programs. And to both of you, sincere thank you from our board and members. You guys did a great job. And now, here is Margie to tell you about today.
Thank you, John, for that nice surprise. I am so happy to welcome back to the Redmond Historical Society today's speaker, Knute Berger. Knute is also known to viewers of KCTS 9 as a columnist for Crosscut and host of Mossback's Northwest. Welcome, Knute, to today's Saturday speaker program.
Here I am. Thank you, Margie.
Thanks.
Delighted to be here.
Today our theme is overcoming adversity with resilience and what lessons we can learn from our history. Let's take a moment to look at our own history, the recent history of the Redmond Historical Society itself. 2 years ago, as John said, our February speaker program was snowed out by a massive snowstorm, but we managed to make it for a later date. Then, in February 2020, many of our viewers today will remember attending your jam-packed program, Knute. For those viewers who weren't there, I'll simply tell you that it was a riveting look into the fascist movement of the 1930s in the Pacific Northwest and in Redmond. And to say it was well attended would be an understatement. I think we had 158 of us who managed to jam ourselves into one room at the Redmond Public Safety Building. And that was the last time we met in person. For many of us, it was the last time we were with lots of people in a room anywhere. The first COVID-19 cases in the United States were just being reported within our own East Side neighborhoods. At that time, as chair of our speakers program, I decided to consult an expert in epidemics, past and present. And based on his expert advice, I decided to learn from his history from the 1918 flu pandemic. And our board decided to cancel any further in-person programs until we figured out what to do. Well, here we are in February 2021, doing our programs on Zoom, which most of us probably didn't even know existed before we all had to learn to use it. In fact, we've all reflected a lot during this time about ourselves, our fellow citizens, and our communities, and about the nature of the pandemic itself. We've learned about our own strengths and weaknesses. We are still learning, and we are resilient. Behind me, you see a poster that expresses this idea perfectly. It was created by Seattle artist Man-Yi Chow, a Chinese-born American, for the encouragement of the Asian community of Seattle. When artists confront adversity, they make art. This poster reminds the people in the Asian community of their own resilience. The poster has been collected by Seattle's Museum of History and Industry, also known as MOHI. The museum has been making a collection of all kinds of artifacts that have been made in response to the COVID pandemic. I can imagine future members of our organization 100 years from now having a look at that collection as they deal with a pandemic in the future. They'll try to learn from the past. It's also a reminder that art making is always a big part of earth-shaking historic events. Knute Berger, you have been learning too. Tell us about the research you've been doing over the past year. What can we learn from the history of the flu pandemic of 1918 that could be helpful to us now?
Margie, thank you for that introduction. And I well remember last year's talk, partly because the audience, the Redmond Historical Society, was so engaged with the material that we were discussing. It was really a very satisfying experience. Also wanted to answer the question that was raised earlier about who's gotten a vaccine or has something to tell. I got my first vaccination a week ago today in Redmond at Kaiser, and I'm scheduled for my second shot the first Saturday in March. So I'm very thankful that that opportunity was available to me. You know, as we were sort of, talking, this talk has several different parts to it. It's basically about looking at resilience, looking at dealing with adversity in our history. And my remarks today are sort of in three parts. The first part is about the pandemic of 1918. And the second part will be some brief remarks about the Boeing recession of the early 1970s. Then we'll probably take a little break there for Q&A on those first two parts. And then I'll show a video of a woman from the Depression era who I think will inspire us all with her personal strength and resilience. And then we can have some more questions and answers after that. As Margie mentioned, it was really almost exactly a year ago that people in the United States became aware that the coronavirus pandemic was right here in the United States. The first known case was a man in King County to die of coronavirus. And also at the same time that there was an outbreak in a care facility in Kirkland. And so, this talk kind of marks a year of my own explorations into the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, when the pandemic hit and was here in our community. I am a writer for crosscut.com as well as doing videos on KCTS, and I was tapped to dig into the history of the pandemic and see whether or not there were things that we could learn from it, and creating a picture of it for our readers. And I wrote more than a dozen pieces in the last year from material that I found. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you and sort of talk you through some of the things I learned about that pandemic, which interestingly, I can talk about this more about this later, but I discovered had impacted my own family in 1918 in a fairly profound way. I'm going to go to share screen here, so bear with me. Here we go. Get the slideshow from the beginning. So starting out, with the pandemic's arrival. So the so-called Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 was the worst global health crisis in human history in terms of the number. It took at least 50 million lives worldwide. In the United States, it killed an estimated close to 700,000 people. I'm sure that's an undercount, as most scholars are as well, who've gone back and looked at excess death rates. In Washington State, it killed at least 5,000 people and probably far more. The methods for counting and assessing what people died of and death and pneumonia versus Spanish flu, the guidelines were not as clear. I mean, we have trouble counting it now, but and the reporting mechanisms were not as comprehensive as they are today. The Spanish flu came at an interesting time. It began, first signs of it were at Camp Lewis near Tacoma and in the Bremerton shipyard. And this made sense because the flu epidemic really broke out on the East Coast in the spring of 1918, and it hit communities in Boston, Philadelphia, New York very, very hard. And it seemed to have started in military encampments in Kansas and had spread in those encampments in the Midwest. And it began to show up here a little bit in September, although I think the military officials were in some denial. A group of sailors from Philadelphia came into the naval yards for training, and they appeared to have brought it with them. And it began breaking out here in Seattle. And by early October of 1918, they knew the pandemic had finally arrived in Washington State, centered in the Puget Sound region. And they began to take steps to shut down the city and cities throughout the Puget Sound region. I'm focusing on Seattle, but this was true in, Tacoma and Olympia and other Bellingham, Everett, other cities on Puget Sound. This headline from the Seattle Times, October 5th of 1918, churches, schools, shows closed, epidemic puts a ban on all public assemblies. And this was a unique thing. I mean, this had not happened before, a complete shutdown of just about everything. They did make exceptions. And it's important to remember that when the flu arrived, it arrived in wartime. The United States was in the middle of World War I, and the Puget Sound region was a big part of the military engine in terms of the Navy and building of ships in the shipyards, the shipping of products, mining, the timber industry, logging, and also agriculture, producing food. Food in some cases was rationed. So in addition, or in the exception of closing the various theaters and schools, there was controversy, as there is today, over closing churches. They kept open what they considered vital businesses. And so the shipyards kept going, anything to do with the military supply, drugstores were considered necessary, grocery shopping could continue, but anything that was dubbed as optional, bars, billiard parlors, and other things were shut down. And I like this headline from the Seattle Star. You say, if it helps win the war, the Star is for it. And then you can see, but down below was a big headline from France in World War I, Yanks break through. And the war effort was, of course, combined both with the spread of the Spanish flu, but also with fighting the Spanish flu. Here you see soldiers marching through downtown Seattle with their flu masks on. And one of the things that appealed to people, appeals that were made to people, was that fighting the Spanish flu was patriotic. And so if the military mobilization had helped, spread the problem, It also was helping to fight the problem in the sense that, for example, the Red Cross had been mobilized. A significant number of women had been recruited as Red Cross volunteers, providing services for the massive numbers of soldiers and sailors that were coming in and out of the region. They were put to work making masks, flu masks, because those things, you couldn't go on Amazon and buy a flu mask. And so they created hundreds of thousands in very short order of flu masks for the general population. And people were required to wear these masks in public. This ad on the right is interesting to me. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases. And then you can see down below, it says, as dangerous as poison gas shells. Basically, they were trying to convey to people the importance of the spread of the disease. And there were many unknowns about that. For example, one of the things they did not know in 1918 was that people who were asymptomatic could spread the influenza. And that was learned, it took some significant tragedy to occur for them to finally realize that you could spread it without coughing and sneezing, but certainly there was a kind of general prohibition. And people generally were compliant with these new regulations, even though they didn't like them. Because they felt it would help win the war. It was helping the war effort. These are just some pictures from newspapers, including the San Francisco papers, Spokane and others in the region, showing people wearing masks. This was, have your politician don a mask and show that this is what you should be doing. There was a lot of resistance to wearing masks. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but this was a new and novel thing. Nobody really liked the masks. They were thick and heavy. But beyond that, there was a desire that people comply with this measure for the sake of public health. I found this ad from the Pike Place Market on the left here, Public Market Center. And the market stayed open. Just not unlike it has during much of the pandemic. No crowding permitted, shop early, avoid people, no special sales on Saturday. They used to have big Saturday discounts on produce. They ended those because too many people jammed in. You had to wear a mask while shopping. And if you were not wearing a mask, you could not shop there. I love this picture of the newsboy in front of the closed theater. Just sort of a picture of that era. People, the shutting down of the movie theaters and the dance halls and vaudeville and those kinds of things were very unpopular. I mean, there was no commercial radio. There certainly wasn't television or the internet. Socializing and going to these public events and dances was sort of all people had, and to have that completely shut off, people were very, very impatient about that. The flu shutdown started in October. It included schools. The school superintendent in Seattle was very opposed to that. It lasted about 6 weeks, from early October until mid-November. And in that time, you can see on the right there, the Seattle PI, just like newspapers today, charted cases and the death rate. And so you could follow in the paper every day. The Seattle Times had something similar. You could track every day how many people were getting sick, how many people died. There were often lists in the newspapers. The community scrambled to open more temporary hospitals. Those Red Cross nurses were also enlisted in helping in these temporary hospitals that were set up in the King County Courthouse, the old King County Courthouse up on First Hill near where Harborview is. Temporary morgues were apparently set up. That's something I'm still looking into, but is kind of intriguing with how the city managed the large death rate. The restrictions came off in mid-November of 1918, and there were two reasons, I think. One was that the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, And the public would not be stopped from celebrating the end of World War I. And so there were parades, there were parties, there were bonfires, there were all kinds of events which got people together in a way that would help spread the disease. And also they had started to see some of the case numbers go down. So they felt confident that maybe they had licked this thing. They hadn't. They lost as many people after that as before. So it was really kind of midway in the pandemic that they lifted the mask requirement, that they began having, allowing people to socially engage. The picture on the left is, I think, a remarkable photograph. In all of my research on the pandemic, I found this at the Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma. I found it online, but that's where the original exists. It's an Ashel Curtis photograph. It's the only photograph I've been able to find of a Spanish flu fatality. This young man, John Corson, died at Providence Hospital in December of 1918. He's having a Greek Orthodox funeral service at Lakeview Cemetery, right on the top of Capitol Hill. To me, it puts a face on some of the victims of Spanish flu. We tend to get caught up in the numbers and the policies and everything, but this was real people. And the interesting thing about it was that, and you may have heard this, but the pandemic was unlike other epidemics that had occurred, in that usually in an epidemic, very young people and very old people die, and people in the middle do fairly well. The Spanish flu was different. Spanish flu was relatively few young people died, and old people did not die disproportionately. It mainly impacted young, healthy people, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, not just people in the military, but athletes. And of course, the most famous story about this is in March of 1919, the flu was still raging in Seattle, despite the lack of restrictions. The Seattle Metropolitans hockey team was playing for the Stanley Cup. They were trying to win it for the second time. They were playing the Montreal Canadiens here in Seattle. And both teams came down with the Spanish flu, and their coaches, and were very sick. And the star player of the Canadiens died of the Spanish flu here in Seattle. The series was called off, and it's the only time that no Stanley Cup has been awarded. The teams were basically tied, with I think Seattle having the advantage. But it just goes to show that it didn't matter if you were young and athletic. The Spanish flu could be just as deadly, if not more deadly, than for other segments of the population. In terms of treating the flu, of course, they didn't have as many measures as we have now. There never really was a complete vaccine, as we would know it today, developed for it. There were serums that were injected mainly into things like shipyard and defense workers to keep them on the job. But the general public was offered all kinds of cures. Now, I'll say just very quickly, Seattle was sort of, it was under prohibition. We voted prohibition in a general way in 1916. During the war, additional limitations were put on alcohol sales to soldiers, so that within, I think, 5 miles of any military installation, you could not serve, soldiers could not buy alcohol. And there's a potion here on the far right called beef, iron, and wine. This was sold in local pharmacies, and you'll notice it's 17% alcohol. Basically, it's very strong drink. There was a vendor in Bremerton who was brought up on federal charges related to the war effort for serving or selling beef, iron, and wine to a sailor. And so they really cracked down during that period on alcohol consumption. On the other hand, you can see in the far left on the upper right, hospitals given supply of whiskey. So on the one hand, they're cracking down on alcohol sales because of prohibition and military limitations. And on the other hand, they're giving the alcohol to hospitals in the belief that somehow whiskey is going to help cure the Spanish flu. I have the feeling it was for the doctors and the nurses, but anyway. And then you had advertisers claiming that they had cures or remedies for the Spanish flu, including Horlick's malted milk and Vicks Vapor Rub. These were things that people turned to in the absence of things like sure shot serums, inoculations, vaccines. I mentioned that there was resistance to wearing masks. Here are a couple of headlines and a picture that illustrate that. On the far left, we've got a man being turned down from getting on a Seattle streetcar because he's not wearing a mask. He's not obeying the law. You could get ticketed or arrested if you insisted on trying to get on public transit without a mask. In Walla Walla, the business community resisted the mask mandate, refused to impose it. And this was an argument over whether the state government could tell a city government what to do, and the sheriff refused to enforce the state mask mandate. And a different approach was taken in Yakima. The other headline there was that customers who did not wear masks, but who went to local merchants to buy produce or whatever, were arrested. This is an example of 15 people who weren't wearing masks were arrested. These are customers being arrested. So each community kind of cracked down in its own way, usually with things like fines and tickets, and in some cases jail. Here are two individuals that played key roles in the pandemic in Washington State. The gentleman on the right with the fur coat and the fancy hat and coat, that is Ole Hansen, who was mayor of Seattle during the pandemic period. And he had about the toughest mayoral job you can imagine. The city was in the midst of a world war. The city was mobilized for the war effort. There were people who were exploiting and profiteering in anything from jacking up rents to inflating the price of coffins. So the times were, kind of tough. There was prohibition, so there was bootlegging. They were trying to crack down on that. There was significant labor unrest. Workers were kind of biting their tongues during the war. They didn't like the hours and pay. That resulted, of course, in the Seattle General Strike in March of 1919, which scared the wits out of every mayor and the national government, believing that Bolshevism was taking over Seattle. The strike lasted, relatively less than a week. While it scared everybody about the Red Menace, it was shut down peaceably, and labor negotiations took place. And Mayor Hansen was given a lot of credit for that. In the midst of this, war, prohibition, social unrest, labor unrest, the pandemic happened. And so it was one of a big list of to-dos. Mayor Hansen never finished his mayoral term. He quit in 1919, the summer after, not shortly after having been, a bomb having been sent to City Hall by anarchists. And he also had aspirations of using his popularity from the general strike to run for president. That didn't pan out. He ended up moving to California. But without his sort of strong decision-making about enforcing social distancing and shutdowns during that first part of the pandemic, Seattle would have fared worse. Seattle fared better than many big cities in terms of its percentage of people who died, in part because of these restrictions. And those restrictions were designed by this guy, Thomas Tuttle. I called him our Fauci. He looks kind of like Fauci, doesn't he, Dr. Fauci? And he played the similar role. He was the head of the Washington State Health Service. He was a dedicated scientist. He was not political. And he made decisions that made him very unpopular with politicians. despite being told that he had a free hand and would not be interfered with. Well, in January of 1919, the legislature was about to convene, as it does in January, and Tuttle had shut down much of Olympia, and he ordered that no gubernatorial balls take place. This was a big, huge social and political event that occurred with people from all over the state. He closed the galleries in the Capitol and limited public gatherings. And as you can see, by February, he was out of a job. He was essentially fired in the middle of the pandemic because of pandemic restrictions. And of course, we know that this has happened to other health officials around the country during our current pandemic, or has at least been, in some cases, threatened. I include this picture for two reasons. One is that much of what is now the UW campus was turned into a military training facility. And the facility was one of the first places that flu victims began to turn up among these young soldiers and sailors that were there. The other reason is that technology really began to, play a role in the pandemic. This picture's never been published before. This group are trainees in radio technology, and ship to shore and ground to air and longer distance radio transmission was kind of a big technological breakthrough during this pandemic period. Also, the extending the capacity of the phone system. One problem they had was keeping the young women, mostly young women who were phone operators, healthy. Many of them got sick. They had to limit the number of calls people could make at certain times at the peak of the pandemic. They didn't want hospital phone lines being busy and that kind of thing. Radio was used to warn remote communities or deliver information from remote communities about medicines that were needed, asking for doctors to come up to Alaska or other places. So you had this kind of interesting tech aspect of this new technology, which was helping fight the pandemic in many ways. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you had a lot of resistance to vaccinations. Now, this preceded the pandemic. And the woman on the left there is Laura Little. She was based in Portland, and she was an anti-vaccination activist. And she worked all over the country, but she was based here in the Pacific Northwest. She came to places like Seattle to lecture. She believed in kind of alternative medicine. And right on the heels of the Spanish flu pandemic, there was a smallpox outbreak in Seattle schools. And there were many students, here's a headline, 265 declined to comply with the order to be inoculated against smallpox. And I just think it's interesting that you would think after the pandemic that there would be this desire for the public health system to function better and to provide answers and solutions and medicine. But in fact, many people's confidence in public health was undermined. And there were so many different versions of the Spanish flu, would masks help or hurt? You would hear doctors arguing both sides of that I think it helped kind of undermine, for a time, belief in public health. And the anti-vaccination movement seemed to get a boost. This is just a group of kids in Tacoma getting ready for their inoculations. They made it a requirement that if you wanted to come to school, you had to be inoculated against smallpox or you had to quarantine. And I threw this in because don't be a grumbler. It's good advice for today. Basically, people were just said, look, yes, it's inconvenient. You can't go to a movie. Schools and churches are closed, but the health of the city is more important, an ounce of prevention, etc. And there have been many times when I've wanted to post this. on Twitter and whatnot, tell people just, we gotta grit our teeth. Now I'm just gonna make a few comments briefly about the Boeing recession and talking about resilience. I think the Boeing recession is a really interesting lesson because it's 50 years after the flu pandemic. It's also 50 years ago. And we call it the Boeing recession. It really started in 1969, but didn't get going significantly till 1970. I'm sure those of you who have lived through it, remember people being laid off. Unemployment spiked to 15%. One of the reasons Boeing was having trouble, there was general economic trouble and recession, but Boeing had bet everything on the 747 and sales were slow. They weren't selling any planes. Boeing laid off 60,000 of 100,000 workers in the region. So it was the largest economic crisis since the Great Depression. To me, the interesting thing, well, here's a picture of people protesting during the Boeing recession. Of course, it was in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of protests going on. Again, social upheaval, anti-war activity. And there's some student protesters there telling Boeing to, start hiring again and build transit. In the layoffs. There were also a lot of budget cuts to the social safety net, people objecting to that. And of course, you had a lot of things that started up, food banks and whatnot that are still going today, that started up as a response to the massive unemployment that the recession created. But the resilient part to me is interesting because if you look at the decade of the 1970s, and in the midst of this economic crisis, you see all kinds of signs of life, especially at the grassroots. And you see the creation of institutions and activities and events that we really associate with Seattle and the region today. Bumper Shoot was launched, the first Bumper Shoot, 1971. Seattle Film Festival was launched. The first Gay Pride Parade was held. A lot of groups looking for to be included. And so you had the founding of El Centro de la Raza, the building of Daybreak Star out at Discovery Park. So you have the Black community, the Native community, the Hispanic community being in the public facilities being created in order to give recognition and a voice to these groups. The Burke-Gilman Trail right-of-way was acquired and turned into, a national model of bike and pedestrian urban trails. This is a march of people supporting the Burke-Gilman, marching down the railroad tracks. You had the pea patches, the neighborhood pea patches starting up. You had activists who were able to stop the R.H. Thompson Expressway from coming through the Arboretum and breaking up neighborhoods in Seattle. There was a surge of sustainability-oriented urban design. We didn't really use the word sustainability then, but it's essentially what that is, an anti-freeway movement. And the decade then ended with some entrepreneurial activity that we all recognize that made a significant difference. And in 1979, 2 local boys moved back home with their business. And of course, people in Redmond know what the impact of Microsoft has been to the city and to the region. And so you have this sort of building on what Boeing had started in technology, now growing into the high-tech sector that we have today. And in 1971, Starbucks was founded. These 3 crazy guys got together and decided to sell artisanal coffee. That's something that's gone around the world. So to me, it's an interesting example of a very difficult time in Seattle and people coming together and figuring out in entrepreneurial ways, in the arts, in social justice, figuring out ways from the grassroots to create institutions that have become a major part of the city and our identity today. And that gives me a lot of hope in thinking about the economic impacts of the pandemic, the medical advances, and the sort of stick-to-itiveness that people in this region have. This gives me a lot of hope for the future. So that is the end of this part of the presentation. And if anybody has questions about it, I'd be happy to answer them. And then we have a video to show after maybe we answer a few questions.
Sure, and there is still time to get those questions in. Again, as I said, there's a Q&A option and a chat option at the bottom of your Zoom window. So feel free to send those in to us. But first, I wanted to start by sort of recapping our informal pandemic poll at the beginning of our presentation today. And we had a pretty good range of everybody at every different stage of vaccination, from some like myself that are not eligible quite yet, to people who have either already gotten their second shot or are in the midst of getting it, have one scheduled. So a pretty wide range there. And a couple of trends that I saw is it seems like people are having the most success with sort of established medical organizations. So we saw Kaiser, University of Washington Medical Center. Although there are a couple outliers, I saw Costco in there as well. And I know QFC has a scheduling website up. So there are some sort of more unusual sources out there. And another one that I saw in our responses and have come across quite a bit myself is people who are sort of outsourcing finding those appointments, because it seems like a lot of people either have gotten their first vaccination appointment and scheduling the second one seems to be pretty straightforward from there. But other people are having a lot of trouble finding an appointment in the first place. And so I'm seeing a lot of, well, my daughter-in-law, my son, my neighbor, so on and so forth are helping search for appointments. And we also saw a number of people who are, you know, as our presentation does today, relating sort of the events of 1918 to kind of what we're going through today and experiencing, and seeing our family history pop back up again. Quite a few people who have family members that had different experiences during 1918. But there were a couple questions I wanted to touch on that I thought had interesting parallels to today. So when we first started into this pandemic, there were a lot of articles about the 1918 pandemic and sort of the parallels between now and then. And I wondered if you had anything to speak to as far as misinformation and different sort of incorrect ideas that were prevalent during 1918. I know one that I saw was that there was a pervasive idea that masks were more like a hat or a coat, something that you put on when you went outside, but wasn't necessarily required inside, which of course, as we know, is sort of the exact flip of what people should have been doing. But I wondered if you had any other examples, Knute.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples. I mean, one of the things was there were some doctors and medical authorities who really resisted the idea that the Spanish flu was anything other than a regular influenza. And so they prescribed treatments that they would prescribe normally. And those would include, you know, bed rest and that kind of thing. But often one common thing was open your window, get fresh air. So the idea was, you know, that fresh air when you were indoors was really important. I think with the masks, there were doctors who believed that wearing masks made the pandemic worse, and you see that has come up again today as a criticism. So there was a belief that masks actually spread the disease, you know, that your germs would get caught in this cotton mask and then you would be spreading it that way. the evidence was mixed on masks. It's interesting, and a lot of it had to do with the kinds of masks people were wearing and whatnot. But there was also this belief that, you know, the pandemic had stemmed from foreign influences. They're kind of this paranoia. You know, it had to have come from China. There was no evidence for that whatsoever, except China was far away and seemed kind of sinister to many people. There was the idea that the Germans had somehow launched canisters of the disease onto the continent, that it was, you know, caused by the Germans and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of rumor and worry about it in terms of the cause being an external one, and thus, you know, we call it the Spanish flu. Gives it that sort of foreignness, but there's a really good case to be made that it might have originated in Kansas, and one of the best histories of the Spanish flu details in the case for that. So, you know, there was a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of it came from competing medical authorities.
Sort of related to that question, we had a submission that touched on, you know, why we see people accept that information and sort of how it affected this idea of civic responsibility in relation to the pandemic. And I was interested, especially in 1918, you know, how America and that idea of mask wearing or different preventative measures as civic responsibility differed from sort of how that concept was being accepted in other countries.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that in America there was this sort of fundamental belief that the government really could only tell you what to do in time of war. That people were willing to follow federal mandates or federal instruction during wartime, and those government departments expanded quite a bit during the war under Woodrow Wilson. And there was also a lot of resentment and pushback about that, and particularly here in the West, where, you know, this was the frontier where you know, government authority was didn't have a heavy hand, and and so I think that there was probably a greater level of compliance in areas where central authority was more respected than here in the United States. I definitely think that had an effect. What I was really struck is that in public health terms, science really improved as a result of the flu. The researchers at Johns Hopkins and other institutions really jumped on it. Really, there were people in public health who, you know, became vocal advocates. There were other people who just didn't believe public health at all, the government. And the system was that the authority for public health was at the county level, and then they kind of reported up to the state. The federal government had very little role itself. And so you had this patchwork of jurisdictions, each one.
Related to that question, we had someone else who asked, you know, were anti-vaxxers back in 1918 ever officially censored? And, you know, I'd expand that really to any of the pushback we saw against, you know, authorities, whether at a county level, a state level, a federal level. Was there any official censorship?
There was some censorship of the anti-vaxxers. Laura Little, who I mentioned, the Smith Act was an act passed in the World War I era that basically was so broadly written. It basically said that if you did anything to undermine the war effort, you could be arrested for treason, essentially. And and it was so general that it included people who made relatively casual comments. You could be on a public bus or train and make some comment like, well, gee, I don't think the Kaiser's so bad. We shouldn't be in this war anyway. You could be arrested for that. Well, Laura Little was arrested in the Dakotas. She went, I think it was in North Dakota, was arrested by the US government on federal charges for violating the Smith Act because she was criticizing the vaccination efforts of the Army to get its soldiers vaccinated against the Spanish flu. And she was telling people not to, she was undermining the draft effort. This was seen as undermining military morale. So she was arrested for that. Now, the charges were later dropped and it didn't shut her up. But there really wasn't any way to officially censor people. But public health officials did complain. And I have a quote here from one of the Seattle public health officials during that smallpox, the rebellion against inoculation against smallpox in Seattle schools. He says, Seattle is a hotbed for anti-vaccination Christian Science and various anti-medical cults. And it's true that in the Pacific Northwest, a ton of quacks. I mean, just people offering, what we would consider today alternative medicine, but also going way beyond that. And this was not very well regulated. And, the West and the Northwest have long attracted utopians, idealists, eccentrics, that kind of thing. And they were in full bloom during that period.
Another question we've gotten from a couple of different people is, approximately how long did sort of the shutdowns and mask mandates in 1918 last? And then, how ultimately did that pandemic end?
Yeah. Oh, those are good questions. So I can speak to what happened in Seattle, and it was paralleled in other major cities. The big shutdown in the Northwest, anyway, in the West Coast, happened in about a 6-week period from October to mid-November. And then afterwards, in places where there were flare-ups, there was an attempt to reinstate some of those restrictions. So some schools were closed, then opened, then reclosed. In San Francisco, for example, there was a mask mandate that lasted, I think, until January or so. Then it came off, and people had formed an official anti-mask association that was holding mass meetings with 1,000 people. And then they tried to reinstate the mask mandate in early 1919 as the numbers of victims began going up again, and they couldn't do it. There was so much political pressure against it. And I think in some ways, the attitudes they were so used to death. There was so much death, not just from the pandemic, but from the war. You can look in the paper and see the lists of, local boys who aren't coming home and that kind of thing. I think the flu almost seemed secondary to the war deaths, even though many of those deaths were due to the Spanish flu and pneumonia. And so I think there was a way that the flu was sort of seen by a lot of people as just something we need to put up with. And eventually it ran its course. Now, I will say that the numbers show that we talk about it as the 1918 pandemic or the 1918-1919 pandemic. It actually lasted into 1921. If you look at excess death rates, you look at underreportings and that kind of thing, it certainly went through the winter of 1920. And there are cases of flare-ups into 1921. So yes, I guess, eventually there was some kind of a herd immunity was attained because so many people had the flu. We don't know how many people got it and were asymptomatic. And, but, you know, it's pretty clear that that particular version of the flu ran its course and must have mutated into a variety that was less lethal.
Now, I think that's about all the time we have for questions for this section. Unfortunately, there's still lots of great questions and lots of things I would love to touch on, but we will be sending out some more information in a follow-up email. So there will be a few more resources in there for sort of further research. And, you know, I think a lot of our conversation and your presentation today sort of touches on the resilience and the ability of, you know, different organizations and institutions now and then to sort of, you know, the pandemic pivot to something new and a little bit different. So our next section, I'll let Margie take it away to inform you a little bit more about that.
Well, thanks, Holly. This is going to be a change of pace. Knute, you have another program you brought us from your Mossback's Northwest series. Could there possibly be a connection between what we've just heard about, Seattle pandemic history, and Boeing's woes, and a Hollywood movie? We want to know.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm going to show an episode of Mossback's Northwest that aired very recently. And then we can chat a little about it after. It's about an 8-minute segment. And let me get it going here. Can you see that? Am I? Let's see. Hang on. Okay.
In this age of tech, we often forget that Seattle is a seaport. Our self-image was forged on the waterfront, from ferries to fishing boats, schooners to container ships. We have a Puget Sound maritime heritage all our own. And one salty character spread that image far and wide. She was popular in print, on the silver screen, and TV. She was hearty, humorous, and hard-boiled. Meet Tugboat Annie. People of a certain age might remember Annie. She was tough, plus-sized, and middle-aged with a heart of gold and a hearty appetite. She lived and worked in the mythical town of Secoma on Puget Sound, aboard her working tugboat, the Narcissus.
The old Narcissus ain't never let us down yet, has she?
In the midst of the Great Depression, Annie held her own, hauling lumber, towing ships, and outfoxing her competitors.
What's the matter with you?
You're on my foot, you big ox.
Oh,
The rough and tumble waterfront of the 1930s was a kind of last frontier for a maritime industry transitioning from sail to steam to diesel. Annie was a liveaboard entrepreneur who survived by her wits and nautical know-how, forging a life at sea with the reality of Hooverville on the tide flats just a short swim away. Annie was the literary creation of a writer named Norman Riley Raine, a World War I veteran turned writer who came to Seattle in 1930 to teach short story writing at the University of Washington. While here, he was inspired by the people and stories of the waterfront. And he began publishing a series of popular, humorous stories about the plucky Tugboat Annie in the Saturday Evening Post. Raine became aware of the legendary Thea Foss. She was a Norwegian immigrant who, starting with a humble rowboat, launched Foss Tugboat Company in Tacoma into the largest tug and barge outfit on the West Coast. Raine's Annie was a tough, working-class woman, but she was more. She was street smart in the ways of the waterfront. In story after story, she outsmarted her unsavory competitors. Her main nemesis was Horatio Bullwinkle, a tugboat interloper from where else? California, who used every dirty trick to put Annie out of business. As Rain wrote his stories, he began to imagine the Oscar-winning silent and Depression-era film star Marie Dressler as Annie. MGM Studios decided to make a movie based on Tugboat Annie, starring Dressler and Wallace Beery as her drunk of a husband.
MGM filmed some sequences on location in Seattle. They used a Foss tug, now called the Arthur Foss, for shots they took down on Lake Union and Elliott Bay.
They even invited 5,000 Seattleites to create a crowd scene that was shot at Bell Street Pier. In July of 1933, the world premiere of Tugboat Annie took place at Seattle's sold-out Fifth Avenue Theater. The movie became one of the top box office hits of the year. It was the first major Hollywood film ever shot in Seattle. It's hard to imagine, given today's standards, a hit film starring two aging, overweight actors competing successfully against the more glamorous films featuring Clark Gable, Joan Crawford, Gary Cooper. But Tugboat Annie embodied the can-do spirit of the Depression era and blue-collar devotion to work and family that could redeem the working class and help America out of its economic morass, and do it all with good humor. At least, that seemed to be the Hollywood message.
There ain't a better captain between Vancouver and San Pedro.
The hit film spawned two sequels. The first in 1940 co-starred Ronald Reagan. Dressler herself died not long after the original Annie film was made, but she was replaced by others. Annie was also featured in a syndicated Canadian TV series in the late 1950s.
I fall like a old baboon! Annie Brennan, I'll get even with you if it takes the rest of my natural life!
The movies made Annie and Seacoma, Seattle and Tacoma, and Puget Sound widely known and captured an aspect of the city that is still familiar. In one passage from a story, the atmosphere is captured perfectly. Quote, Tugboat Annie sailed out of the room and down the stair to the street. Before her, through the curtain of rain, were sprawled grimy warehouses, railroad sidings, freight sheds, and the masts and funnels of shipping. The air, though murky and smelling of fog and smoke, steam and tidewater and wet pavements, was laced with the damp freshness of a sea wind.
You know that Norman Riley Rain knew this town. That murk and smell and sea wind can still be inhaled today.
Rain left Seattle and moved to Hollywood and went on to become an Oscar-winning screenwriter. Annie has fallen into obscurity, but she deserves rediscovery as a character who embodies an independent, compassionate woman making her way through hard times.
And someone who can maybe teach us how to deal with the bullies of today.
Well, we had a lot of fun making the Tugboat Annie segment. I remember watching, the TV show Tugboat Annie when I was a kid. I loved it. And I didn't really know much about the history of it, but we got to talking about maritime history. We got to talking about the struggles of the Depression era. And to me, Annie really embodies a lot of the kind of personal characteristics that all of us would like to have in terms of, outsmarting the bullies. And she just had such a great energy and integrity. And I'm just fascinated by the fact that that movie became, and the short story series became so popular. Norman Riley Rain is somebody we never hear about today. I talked to a lot of young people who've never even heard of Tugboat Annie. This video was their first introduction to it. I went back and read a bunch of the short stories and was really taken by them. And also it was really fun to shoot part of it on board the Arthur Foss, which is, I believe it's the oldest wooden tugboat in existence, at least in this country. It's down on down in Lake Union, which is where some of the the movie was shot, also in Elliott Bay. And I was also fascinated by this kind of Hollywood connection to Seattle. This being the first film, that Street Pier scene is fun because anybody could come down and be in that sequence. The Mayor John Doerr, who was mayor at the time in the 1930s, he's somewhere in that crowd. I wasn't able to spot him. And the movies are kind of corny in a sort of sentimental 1930s kind of way. I think Annie in the short stories is actually a more interesting character than as portrayed in the movies. She's a little tougher and and quite wily and very competitive. But I just find it very uplifting from many standpoints. And I got a lot of mail about Tugboat Annie. And I think some of the people that have written in to me about that episode were just really pleased to see Seattle and Puget Sound's maritime heritage getting any recognition. It's very difficult to preserve these old boats, even boats like the Arthur Foss. It's tough to keep them afloat. And we've had plenty of examples of vessels, maritime heritage vessels that have been scrapped in recent years. So, there's, I think, an added benefit to giving some exposure to this wonderful preservation project of keeping the Arthur Foss in its original condition. So I hope it'll inspire people to help with that aspect of preservation. So, yeah, but if you have some questions about Annie, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
We did have one question come in. They were wondering if Tugboat Annie inspired Anne and Nancy Wilson's Dreamboat Annie by any chance.
I don't know the story of that, but I've always assumed the title was inspired by that. I also got a letter from a member of the Foss family who said that Norman Riley Rain chose Annie, that Thea Foss had a sister, I believe, named Anne, and that he liked Annie better than Thea for his character, and picked that. Now, I think that's probably apocryphal, but it's a fun tidbit.
Sure. I was also wondering if you could maybe give some examples of how Annie in the movies versus Annie in the written work differs. You mentioned she was a little tougher, but I thought maybe we could get some specific examples.
And almost so in the movie, Annie's husband is alive, played by Wallace Beery. In the book series, she's a widow. Her husband has passed. So the running the tugboat and the salvage company and all that is all on her. So she's really a kind of, the lone female operator in this tough waterfront business. The language in the book series is she's curses up a storm, and of course not using the 4-letter words that we use, are more common today, but these incredibly kind of creative faces. And she was full of malapropisms. She would get famous quotes all tangled and in a way that made them still understandable if kind of humorous nonsense. Every story is really centered around her desperation to outwit this Bullwinkle character who's really out to put her out of business. He cheats. He does all kinds of things to make her life miserable, and she always has to then figure out a way to beat him. And it's always by coming up with her own trick and her own, but still staying within the realm of relatively ethical. She's not as dirty as he is, but she's able to outsmart him. And that comes through in the short stories much more than it comes through in the book. she's a lot more sentimental in the movie. Maria Dressler plays her as a much more sort of sentimental mom, which I think appealed to the broader audience. But in the short stories, she's far less sentimental.
Very neat. I have to admit, I fall into the category of people who have not seen Tugboat Annie, so I will certainly have to watch it. It was really interesting to see a little bit of Lake Union and the Arthur Foss I'm familiar with, because when I first moved to Seattle, I worked at Center for Wooden Boats, so it's a very familiar site to me.
Yeah, you know all about it.
And we did have one other question come in. What was Theo Foss really like? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, she wasn't as flamboyant as Annie. I've had people, tell me about that. There's a debate about, Rain knew, members of her family. I've heard there's also another tugboat woman whose name escapes me at the moment, but that might have helped inspire him. But I think Thea Foss was really smart and really tough, and turned Foss Tug into this, the West Coast's biggest now today, the biggest tug and barge outfit on the whole West Coast. She started with a rowboat. So I think that sort of arc of success of she's an immigrant, she, begins with this very humble beginning in Tacoma and, builds up this sort of maritime thing. But she wasn't out there running tugboats herself. She wasn't down in the engine room, or at least as I understand it. But I think Rain drew on all these kind of multiple sources. Everything is a kind of pastiche. He blended Seattle and Tacoma into Seacoma. It has all the characteristics of both towns. It's an act of imagination as opposed to biography, but it definitely has, kind of multiple roots. Yeah.
Well, it sounds really interesting. I look forward to seeing the movie. But in the meantime, I'll hand things over to Margie to sort of close out our program today. Thank you.
You've really reinforced for me and reminded me that it's the arts that often give us the examples or help us get through our own adversity and to have some resilience. And she sounds like she was a model of resilience. On behalf of our Redmond Historical Society Saturday Speaker Series, Knute Berger, I offer you many thanks for another interesting program, Puget Sound Area History.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Margie.
You're so grateful. And thanks to our viewing audience as well for tuning in today. You'll be receiving an email soon, so you can link to the program if you wish, to this one. And so you have an opportunity to donate to support our programs. We hope to see you next month when our Saturday Speaker Series will welcome David B. Williams, who will speak to us on March 13th on the subject of his book by the same name, Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography. Be sure to mark your calendars, and we'll see you then.